Okay, hello. It's lovely to be in Santiago. I want to just start off saying that this is a jam-packed paper. You can see a model, you can see lots of data, you can get lots of insights into their views about how best basically the Bank of England, it's mostly focused on that, can communicate. So I'm going to just pick out a few things because, again, it's really a paper within a paper within a paper. I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about this communication objective, which we've talked about more broadly in this session. Talk about the rational inattention framework, which is the framework that they're using in their theoretical model. Ask whether or not inattention is actually the problem. I'm going to use a weather forecast analogy to help with that, and then talk more generally about how one could more effectively communicate across diverse audiences, which is, I think, in somewhat what this session is all about. So I just want to remind you all of Alan Greenspan's briefcase. For those of you not old enough, there was a lot of focus on whether or not his briefcase was heavy or light. There was a whole book written on what's inside his briefcase. And this was an era in which there was much more of a sense that this is for the Fed. The Fed was spending more time obfuscating than communicating. And one of the things I want to sort of highlight in my discussion is we're certainly revealing some more of the documents in the briefcase. In most central banks, there's been a big effort to do that, but by no means have we actually dumped out all the contents of the briefcase, and that's where I'm going to kind of go toward. So let's just start off with this idea that there is a need for communication, and that needs to go to a broader audience than just those of us in this room. And the paper really spends a lot of time on the idea of a trade-off, that there is a need to simplify statements, and in simplifying statements, that we are reducing precision and therefore potentially providing incorrect or not the perfect information that you would want in an optimal, any kind of optimal communication model. And I'm going to really stress about whether or not there isn't a simple way to still include some information about probabilities that the statement isn't exactly correct. And again, that's where my weather analogy is going to come in. Michael actually brought this up, and it's a key assumption in their model, and I'm not sure that I would completely agree with, that not reading even in a simplified communication is an absorbing state in the context of his model. So there's no way for a central bank to increase its trust unless people are reading its communications. That seems really severe, and there are lots of other sources of information about what the central bank is doing outside of what the central bank itself says. So that seems like an extreme assumption that I'll want to come back to. So the rational inattention framework is one that is used a lot in monetary policy models. And in this particular case, there is an assumption that needs to be made for a good reason, but I worry about it. So there's an assumption in the model that households can observe wages and relative prices in the current period, but they can't observe the nominal interest rate. They see that with a lag. Now, I think most of us are used to macro models that go in the reverse order, that we can see asset prices like interest rates right away, and it might take us a while to see price movements. Now, they need this assumption, this kind of reversal of assumption, because of the way their shocks are set up. If you saw the interest rate, basically there would be no reason for you to get a communication from the central bank. So the central bank's communication is giving you information about the shocks, which then allows you to back out what the interest rate is, because you don't see the interest rate. And again, I understand why they needed to jimmy things for the model, but it is, again, kind of the reverse of what we would normally expect to see, that you don't see the asset price, but you do see things like prices and wages. And then coming out of the model, the key implication, which, again, Michael made clear, is that out of that inattention model, the central bank should provide as much detail as possible, even though they know that a number of people are not going to be paying attention. And in fact, it might even induce more people to pay less attention. So that's kind of the key insight from the rational inattention framework as they have put it together. So I want us to sort of step back for a moment and think, is inattention really the problem? So I'm going to argue that context is pretty important. So when do people pay attention to central banks? It actually showed up in some of the figures that he showed us. They're likely to pay attention, particularly when there's a lot of volatility in the market, so that's what one of the pictures he showed. But I also think from an individual household level, there's going to be a lot more interest in figuring out what the central bank is doing if, in fact, you're about to make a large purchase. You're going to purchase something perhaps on credit, or you care a lot about where the inflation is going because it's a very large chunk of your income is going on that particular purchase. So I'm going to come back to that, but it does seem context is really important. You're going to pay more attention during different periods of time based on what your own circumstances are or the macro circumstances like higher market volatility. It's also the case, I think, some individuals will always stay informed. Certainly market participants, doesn't matter what you communicate, they're going to be informed, or they're going to stay informed because they need to for their deals. And high net worth individuals in general are going to always be informed. So no matter what you present, they're always going to be reading pretty much everything that the central bank lays out. The next thing that Michael talked about in the paper, and the next kind of layer of his models, so to speak, is this idea of twin deficits. And he's connecting up understanding and trust. And it's a fairly stark set of assumptions that basically trust increases when the central bank engages with the public, so it makes an effort to communicate more broadly. And importantly, it falls when the public is surprised. So when a surprise occurs in the model, basically a surprise is defined as the world not turning out as the central bank said it would, then trust goes completely to zero. I just want to sort of throw out there that there are some other possibilities. You could have full understanding of what the central bank is doing, but not trust them. Right? You could also have full trust in the central bank as an institution without really understanding exactly what they do. I think probably that's going to be true for a large portion of the population. So I'm not sure that these two things necessarily always have to go together. They could go together. I doubt very much they go together quite in the stark way in which they're seen in the model. So here's my weather analogy. So I got this from Weather Underground, in case you wanted to know what the weather is going to be like in Santiago. It's out here. Weather Underground, I think, does a pretty good job of providing a jam-packed piece of information on a very short website. So you know if it's sunny or not, you know if it's cloudy, you know whether or not there's going to be rain, how much rain there's going to be, and they give you a 10-day forecast. If you really want to dig in, you can look at the radar, which was clear when I grabbed this off. But you also have a high and a low. People read, not necessarily Weather Underground, but weather reports. I'll say I read them all the time because I live in a place where weather is crazy. And so I read the weather report even knowing that it's often wrong. I don't lose complete confidence in Weather Underground just because it didn't rain when it said it would. And in fact, I probably pay even more attention to the weather when it was surprising, because then I think, well, now I really have to know what's going to happen tomorrow. I think those of you who live in places where there's a crazy amount of traffic have similar kinds of forecasts. When you decide to go on the highway, you check to see what the traffic is going to look like. You know half the time they're going to be wrong, but you still want to check. In fact, you're probably even more likely to check if you went on the highway and it was more backed up than you had anticipated. You're probably the next day going to check even more carefully, not stop checking altogether. The critical element here is both for weather and for traffic, there is an understanding that surprises occur, that they will not be able to forecast perfectly. The models are complicated, the algorithms they use are complicated, and so getting it wrong doesn't necessarily mean that the next time around they're going to be wrong. It's just that it's hard to predict. It seems like we really want central banks to sort of be in the same place, that people continue to engage with the central bank even when there are surprises that were not predicted from the information that was put out there. Another issue that the paper spends time on is education. And in fact, one of the key kind of connections that they make through the 3 E's is that more education increases the chances of engagement and makes explanation easier. And I wonder if, again, context matters. For any of you who know farmers, they're incredible experts on futures markets. I have a relative in my household who actually had no education past the 8th grade, who's a farmer, who could tell you the most detailed explanations about depreciation allowances in the US tax code depending on losses on farm equipment. So in that context, he knows a lot, even though actually he cannot read. Likewise, people on fixed incomes have a lot of information about inflation adjustments. Even if they wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what inflation is, they know that their monthly check is going to be different if the inflation adjustment looks different. So I wonder if part of our explanations that are coming out of central banks ought to be more targeted to the audience. Some audiences are going to be very well informed on at least some aspects of central bank policy and would be particularly interested in getting certain kinds of information. And one thing I worry about is that we've been talking about information more generally and not targeted information. Again, the focus of this paper is to help us think about the costs and the benefits of these communications with this idea that it will matter for political accountability, to keep central banks independent, to influence expected inflation, which is obviously important for within these models that we're looking at, confidence in the inflation target, and importantly that it would influence consumption. And it seems like you could do that, all of those things, targeting much more clearly the communication to those specific objectives. So let me I'm almost out of time. I'll talk a little bit. A lot of people have talked about this layered content for the BOE. I actually have one on my slide. This is the in a nutshell, which I think is the most simplistic part of the Bank of England communication, the lowest layer, I suppose. And I have to say, I thought it was maybe too simplistic. I thought that more could be said than this to actually be able to take away what's going on. The next layer talks through, like, for example, the Monetary Committee's judgments and how it's changed. And I have to say, I don't know if you can jump between the previous one to this next one. That's a huge jump. And I'm not even sure that we're getting that much information out of this one. And then a last one that comes out of the Bank of England is this bank overground. This is a new chart that they have now introduced to give us a sense of the UK financial conditions. And I don't know about the rest of you, but just looking at this very quickly, I wouldn't necessarily have immediately figured out what was on this graph. Just so you know, the darker line is the sterling rate, and the lighter line is the equity market. But nothing on the chart actually says that directly. And I'm not sure at all that I would, even with more years than I would care to describe education, that I would be able to back out what's going on with this. So again, this is the highest layer, I suppose, but it's hard to know exactly what somebody would get out of this. Couple last things. I know I'm at 0. We talked about the dot plots before. One of the things that I think happens for almost every central bank is if they obfuscate and don't tell you who said what, others try to do the work for you. So this is actually coming from a blog site, Continuum Economics, and I don't even know what that is, but there are a lot of these where they try to guess whose dot plot belongs to who. Actually, I looked around, almost all of them are in agreement. I don't know if they are actually getting the identities correct, but why not just tell us what the identities are, given that everyone's going to be guessing? And I'll say the last one, this is again from the Bank of England, looking at whether or not the market is anticipating an increase in interest rates. The dark blue is what was thought to be the likely path in May. The red, which is going in the opposite direction. So there were interest rate hikes predicted in May, and then interest rate reductions predicted in June. So June was today on this chart. So those are pretty dramatic changes in the inferences of the media of what the MPC was likely to do, which suggests to me that there ought be more information than even the layers that we're getting from the BOE to really get a sense of what's going on. I'll end there.